Picture a June morning in Tehran. Clear sky, 10 million people starting their day. Street vendors setting up stalls. Kids walking to school, old men sipping tea, and the familiar hum of a city waking up. Just another Tuesday. Nobody knew what was coming. At 12,000 meters above them, steel machines weighing dozens of tons glided silently through the sky. No sound, no warning. In an underground command center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, fingers moved across keyboards. Coordinates flashed on screens. Countdown timers ticked towards zero. And just hours earlier, Oman's foreign minister had hung up the phone after an all-night negotiation. He exhaled, he loosened his tie, he thought the hardest part was over. Iran had agreed. Not a partial deal, not 20% enrichment, not 5% zero. Iran agreed to completely abandon its uranium enrichment program, even for civilian use. That was the biggest concession Tehran had ever made in the entire history of nuclear diplomacy. The deal that every American president since Clinton, every European foreign minister, every unnegotiator had spent decades chasing. It was sitting on the table, signed and ready. And then the bombs fell anyway. Welcome to Arc of Power. Today we are not going to recap what you already saw on your phone. We are not going to argue about who is right and who is wrong. Western media and Iranian state media are already painting two completely opposite pictures, and both are trying to sell you something. Instead, let us do something more dangerous. Let us ask the real question. Not why did this war happen? That answer has already been packaged, focus grouped, and prepared for you. The harder question, the one nobody in a primetime studio wants to sit with, is this: who needed this war to happen? And why right now? To get there, start with two contradictions. Two facts that no major outlet will put on the same page. Contradiction 1. Hours before the first Tomahawk missile tore through the sky above Tehran, Oman confirmed that Iran had agreed to zero enrichment. The deal was nearly done. Negotiators had eaten dinner together. People were already discussing the announcement date. So why did the war happen anyway? Contradiction 2. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not a journalist, not an anti-war senator, but the man sitting at the very top of the US military machine, told Congress that the Navy and Air Force had enough ammunition for exactly 4 days of high-intensity combat. 4 days, not 4 months, not 4 weeks. 4 days, after 2 years of draining weapons stockpiles for conflicts elsewhere. So why did the US choose this exact moment to pick a fight with a country of 90 million people, 600,000 square miles of mountainous terrain, ballistic missiles that can reach every US base in the region, and a factory floor producing 500 drones per day? When you place both contradictions side by side, the question changes entirely. It is no longer why. It becomes who benefits. Now let us go through the 5 official reasons for this war, one by one, and watch how long each one holds up before it collapses under its own weight. Reason 1. Stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Sounds reasonable. Sounds like the responsible thing to do, until you remember that Supreme Leader Khamenei issued a fatwa, a binding religious ruling carrying the full weight of the Iranian state, declaring nuclear weapons haram, forbidden by God. He did not say it once in a speech and move on. He repeated it for decades, across administrations, across crises, across every round of sanctions. And then, just hours before the bombs dropped, Iran agreed to zero enrichment, handing over the one concession the West had always demanded. Reason 1. Collapse before the first explosion. Reason 2. Iran's ballistic missiles threaten regional stability. Iran has had those missiles for 20 years. 20. That capability did not appear overnight this summer. It was not a new development, not a sudden escalation, not a red line crossed in the weeks before the strike. So what actually changed? What made this specific Tuesday morning the moment of no return? Other than factors that have nothing to do with missiles at all. Reason 2 does not hold. Reason 3. Protect the Iranian people from a theocratic regime. The most noble-sounding reason of the 5. The humanitarian case. The one that makes the whole operation feel like a rescue mission. Until day 1 of the air campaign, when a stray Tomahawk punched through the roof of an elementary school in Kerman province. In southern Iran, 51 girls, all of them, none survived. The story ran briefly on page 3 of most Western papers, then disappeared. Protecting the Iranian people by killing Iranian children. Reason 3 gone before it ever had a chance. Reason 4. secure oil supplies and protect global energy markets. Look at the map. The Strait of Hormuz, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the single choke point where 20% of the world's oil passes every single day. Iran controls both shores. On day 3 of the war, Tehran ordered a full blockade. Tankers could not move. Oil jumped to $180 a barrel in 72 hours. Us allies in Europe and Japan, economies that depend entirely on Gulf oil, were thrown into immediate crisis. Gas prices in Germany hit record highs. Tokyo announced emergency energy rationing. The plan to secure the oil supply had succeeded in shutting down the oil supply. Reason 4, shattered. Reason 5. And this is the most revealing one. Protect Israel. Nobody in the administration said this publicly, until Secretary of State Rubio sat before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and said it plainly, in words that could not be spun or softened. Israel was about to strike Iran. If the US did not act first, Iran would retaliate against American forces across the region. Stop. Think carefully about what he just admitted. The US did not attack Iran to stop Iran from attacking America. The US attacked Iran to prevent Iran from retaliating after Israel struck Iran first. That is not self-defense. That is the United States walking into someone else's fight, picking up someone else's bill, with American lives and American ammunition that their own generals had already admitted would run out in 4 days. Reason 5 is not a collapse, it is a confession. 5 reasons. 5 stories. 5 times the official narrative contradicted itself in public, on camera, under oath. In science, when a hypothesis fails the test, you throw it out and find a better one. In geopolitics, when one reason falls apart, nobody goes looking for the honest answer. They hand you the next reason, and the next, and the next, until you forget what you were originally asking, until the original question gets buried under the noise. The original question is still there, unanswered, untouched. If it is not nukes, not missiles, not human rights, not oil, not Israel, then what is it? There is something nobody wants you to understand. Not because it is complicated, but because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You will never look at another war the same way again. It is not on any battlefield. It is not inside a missile silo or uranium centrifuge. It does not show up in Pentagon briefings or State Department press releases. It lives in something every single one of us uses every day. Something we trust almost without thinking. Something we have never once been asked to question. The dollar. And this is just the first layer. A piece of paper printed with the face of a man who died over 2 centuries ago. You use it every day. You trust it almost without thinking. And you have probably never once stopped to ask why the entire world agreed that this piece of paper has value. The answer is not in economics textbooks. It is in oil, and once you understand it, everything clicks. The first bomb over Tehran. The generals who admitted they were running out of ammunition. The war that made no military sense. All of it. Let us start with puzzle piece 1. Why America cannot walk away, even knowing it might lose. In 1971, President Nixon did something that most people did not fully understand at the time. He announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate. For decades, the world had run on the gold standard. Every dollar printed had gold reserves standing behind it. Real value, a real anchor. Nixon cut that anchor loose. The dollar became pure paper. Pure faith, with nothing behind it except the credibility of the US government. So what was that credibility standing on? 3 years later, in 1974, Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh. He sat down with the Saudi royal family for a meeting that was not widely covered, whose content stayed classified for decades, and whose outcome quietly reshaped the entire global economic order from that day forward. The deal was simple, ruthless, and brilliant. Saudi Arabia would sell oil to the entire world, but only in US dollars. Not pounds, not francs, dollars only. In exchange, America would protect the Saudi royal family from any threat, supply weapons, and guarantee the regime's survival. The other OPEC nations followed, one by one. And just like that, the petrodollar was born. Here is why this was an almost perfect machine of power. Think of it as a giant gear, turning continuously. Gulf nations sell oil and collect dollars. Those dollars do not sit in vaults. They get reinvested back into America, buying treasury bonds, New York real estate, Silicon Valley stocks, Wall Street assets. That constant flow keeps global demand for dollars permanently elevated. High demand means America can print money, borrow heavily, and spend without triggering the kind of catastrophic inflation that would destroy any other economy. And the gear keeps turning. This is why the United States can carry $34 trillion in national debt and not collapse. Not because the American economy is uniquely strong, but because the entire world is quietly picking up America's tab, through a loop they have no real choice but to participate in. But there is one non-negotiable condition for this gear to keep spinning. One thing, if removed, brings the entire structure down like a skyscraper with its foundation pulled out. The world must keep using dollars to buy oil. Now look at what has been happening over the past several years, and you will understand why the people inside the US Treasury have not been sleeping well. In 2022, Russia and China began settling oil payments in yuan, not dollars. For the first time since 1974, a large-scale oil transaction happened completely outside the dollar system. No fanfare, no headlines, but inside Washington's financial war rooms, every alarm went off. Then Saudi Arabia, the same kingdom that made the deal with Kissinger in 1974, began quietly negotiating to accept multiple currencies for its oil. Not because they hate America, because they want options, because they are tired of being entirely dependent on one patron. Central banks around the world started buying gold at the fastest rate in 50 years. When countries buy gold, they are selling dollars. That is the clearest possible signal that confidence is eroding. And here is the coldest number of all. The dollar share of global foreign exchange reserves dropped from 70% in the year 2000 to 58% by 2024. 24 years. 12 percentage points sounds small. In the world of global finance, that is a tectonic shift. Then BRICS expanded to include 9 new members, representing 45% of the world's population, all of them actively building payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. Think of the petrodollar like a Ponzi scheme. That sounds harsh, but in terms of pure mechanical function, no analogy is more precise. A Ponzi scheme works only as long as new money keeps flowing in to sustain the people already inside. When new money slows down, the whole structure starts to shake. When it stops, it collapses like dominoes. America sees this clearly. They have seen it for years, and they are watching global dollar demand, the new money keeping this whole system alive, slow down year after year after year. The question is no longer whether the system will shake. The question is when it falls, and how fast. And here is the single most important sentence in this entire video. America did not strike Iran out of greed. America struck Iran out of fear. Fear of the morning the world no longer needs the dollar. Fear of the day when $34 trillion in national debt, currently being quietly carried by the whole world through the petrodollar loop, suddenly has no one left to absorb it. And when that clock runs out, the detonation will not happen in Tehran. It will happen in Washington. But if this is all about fear, why now? Why not last year? Why not next year? Why this specific summer, this specific country, these specific bombs? That is puzzle piece 2. And it is colder than the first one. Why right now? There is a concept in computer science called a race condition. 2 processes competing for the same resource at the same time. The outcome depends entirely on who arrives first. If the wrong process wins, the system crashes. No patch. No and no going back. America is inside a geopolitical race condition right now, and it is losing. The dollar's decline is not moving in a straight line. It is accelerating. The coalition moving away from dollar dependency is growing faster than any model predicted. And every year that passes without a decisive move, the window to reverse this trend closes a little more. So what do you do when you are losing a race you cannot afford to stop? You flip the table. Walk through this chain of logic carefully, not speculation, not conspiracy, observable, documented cause and effect. Phase 1. Destroy the Middle East oil supply. Picture the Strait of Hormuz as the single faucet for the entire global economy. Through that 21-mile choke point, 20% of the world's oil flows every single day. Japan imports 90% of its oil through it. So do South Korea, India and China. Shut that faucet and the whole world feels it within days. Iran controls the northern shore of Hormuz. And on day 3 of the war, Tehran did exactly what had been warning it would do for years. It shut the strait, 20% of global oil supply, gone overnight. At the same time, Iranian oil infrastructure, refineries, export terminals, offshore platforms was systematically dismantled. not lightly damaged, structurally eliminated, in a pattern clearly designed to paralyze Iranian oil exports for years, not months. Then, and this is the detail that most coverage glossed over, facilities at Saudi Aramco were struck. Iran was officially blamed. Saudi Arabia announced a complete production shutdown for security reasons. Another 10% of global oil supply gone. Sit with this pattern for a moment. If the stated goal is regime change in Iran, why destroy the infrastructure of your closest Gulf ally? If this is a war for regional security, why do civilian targets appear to be hit at higher rates than military installations? And why, after every single strike on regional oil infrastructure, do US crude oil futures hit a new record high? In game theory, when a pattern repeats consistently and always benefits the same party, that is not coincidence. That is design. Phase 2. Force the world back onto the dollar. Middle East oil disappears, prices spike hard from $80 a barrel to $120 to $150 and climbing. Factories in Germany go dark, gas stations in Japan start rationing. European governments begin calculating emergency fuel allocation for winter. And then the world looks at the map for alternatives. Who is the world's largest oil producer? The United States at 13 million barrels per day, built on the shale revolution. Who just took control of Venezuela after Maduro was arrested in January 2026. A Washington-aligned government. Venezuela, which holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Mexico, under increasing pressure from Washington since trade negotiations turned hostile. When Middle East supply disappears, the only replacement large enough to fill the gap is American oil and oil from countries Washington now controls. And American oil is sold only in dollars. The world has no choice. You want oil, you need dollars. The petrodollar loop is not just revived. It is restarted with a forced urgency that no negotiating table could ever manufacture. Phase 3. Revive the dollar. Global dollar demand spikes. Countries sell gold, sell assets, sell anything convertible fast enough to keep their economies running. The dollar strengthens as treasury yields fall. The weight of $34 trillion in debt becomes lighter, not because America paid any of it back, but because the world is buying American debt again at scale. The gear that looked like it was rusting out starts turning again. Faster, stronger. Bought at least another decade. Step back and look at the full chain one more time. This is not conspiracy theory, this is interest analysis. The same analysis that financial strategists and geopolitical advisors perform every single day. Who benefits? Who has the capability to execute? Who has the motive? The conclusion is uncomfortable, but it is consistent. This is not a war, this is financial surgery performed with bombs. A high-risk operation designed to save the patient by any means necessary. And like every desperate surgery, the surgeon might walk out of the operating room. The patient is not guaranteed to. Which brings us to puzzle piece 3. Who pulled the trigger, and why Trump said yes. Here is a mistake people commonly make when analyzing modern wars. They go looking for one decision maker. One president, one general, one clear villain to blame or hero to credit. The reality is far messier, and far more frightening. No single hand pulled the trigger on this war. Multiple hands did. Each with its own reason, each with its own interest. And all of them pointed at the same target at the same moment. In physics that is called resonance, in geopolitics it is called war. Start with the hand nobody wants to name out loud. Israel the architect. Secretary of State Rubio said it plainly before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. No metaphors. No diplomatic softening. We acted first because Israel was about to strike, and if Iran retaliated against Israel, American forces across the region would be drawn in regardless of what Washington wanted. Read that again slowly. America did not attack Iran to stop Iran from attacking America. America attacked Iran to prevent Iran from retaliating after Israel attacked Iran first. That is the alliance trap, one of the oldest and most dangerous mechanisms in geopolitical history. You engineer a situation where your ally has no exit. They fight because commitment demands it. Because backing down means losing credibility with every other ally watching from the sidelines. But Israel did not build this trap in a single night. They laid these bricks over many months. The 12-day campaign in Judah 25. Israel struck simultaneously across Iran's command networks, eliminating military officials and nuclear scientists. Not just removing people, exposing the full depth of Mossad's penetration inside Tehran, forcing Iran to confront how badly they had been compromised. Before that, the fall of Assad in Syria looks unrelated at first glance. Look closer. Syria was the geographic firewall between Israel and Iran. When Assad fell, the airspace corridor from the Mediterranean to the Iranian border opened completely. Israel could now strike deep into Iran without flying over hostile territory, without navigating Syrian air defenses. Then came the calibrated provocations. WAV strikes on Saudi Aramco traced to Lebanon. A Mossad operation exposed in Qatar in a way that leaked exactly the details needed to serve a specific narrative. Each move cornering Iran a little more, stripping away allies, burning escape routes. Israel's strategic logic is not complicated. Preventive war, strike today because tomorrow the window closes. Iran's missile arsenal grows every year, its drone production scales every year, its regional network expands every year. The cost of action rises with every passing month. So Israel decided, now or never. Now here is why Trump said yes. 4 pressures, all pushing in the same direction. Pressure 1. The domestic economy was hurting. Tariff policies had fed inflation. Growth was slowing. Trump's approval rating had dropped significantly from its post-inauguration peak. In American political history, there is no more reliable tool than war for consolidating public support behind a sitting president. The rally around the flag effect is one of the most documented phenomena in political psychology. And Trump had studied an even sharper lesson from watching Zelensky and Erdogan, 2 wartime leaders he had openly admired. In wartime, elections can be delayed. Political timelines become flexible. A president at war holds powers a peacetime president simply does not have. Pressure 2. The military establishment needed a war. Defense Secretary Hegseth had proposed sweeping cuts to military staffing and budget. His logic was efficiency. In World War I, America used 7 4-star generals to command 16 million soldiers. Today, the military uses nearly 40 4-star generals to command 132 million. That is a command structure bloated beyond any rational explanation. Those generals were not going to accept retirement quietly. They have institutional power, political connections, and the ability to shape policy from the inside. A war, any war, is the most powerful argument available for why the entire apparatus remains indispensable. When people face losing institutional privilege, they find ways to manufacture necessity. Pressure 3. The people sitting next to Trump. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, Trump's most trusted Middle East envoys, are both committed Zionists with documented close ties to Netanyahu and the Israeli political establishment. This is not a secret, it is public record. The problem is not their personal views. The problem is that diplomatic engagement with Iran, the engagement that determines whether there is peace or war, was handed to men with deep personal and ideological stakes in that diplomacy failing. That is not neutrality at the table. That is institutionalized conflict of interest. Pressure 4. Legacy. Trump wanted to be remembered. Every president does. But Trump in his second and final term, with a clear sense that this was his last window to define his place in history, was uniquely sensitive to the question, what will I be known for? Solving Iran was the prize that had eluded Obama and Biden both. If Trump could declare, quickly and decisively the way he had moved on Venezuela, that he had neutralized the Iranian nuclear threat, that is a front-page headline for the history books. The problem is Iran is not Venezuela. 4 pressures. 4 streams converging at a single point. The signature of the President of the United States. Trump did not design this game. He signed the final order. And when that many forces all want the same war at the same time, that war becomes nearly inevitable, regardless of who holds the pen. But there is one more player. A player we have been describing as the victim, who is actually one of the most deliberate players at the table. Puzzle piece 4. Why Iran did not back down, even knowing what was coming. Day 1 after the bombs fell, Western television ran footage of collapsed buildings in Tehran on loop. Analysts used one word more than any other to describe Iran's leadership. Irrational. Reckless. Suicidal. Try a different frame. You are a civilization that has existed for 3,000 years. You survived Alexander the Great. You survived Genghis Khan. You survived the Ottoman Empire, British colonialism, and a CIA-engineered coup in 1953 that overthrew your democratically elected prime minister. And now a nation that has existed for 250 years is telling you to stand down. Through 3,000 years of experience, America looks like a recent development. A teenager with a very loud voice. Iran is not irrational. Iran is playing a different game, on a different clock, with a different definition of winning. Here is the calculation Tehran placed in front of itself. Option 1. Full capitulation. Abandon the nuclear program. Dismantle the missiles. Dissolve the regional partner networks from Lebanon to Yemen. Accept every demand from Washington and Tel Aviv. Look at Venezuela for the result. Maduro surrendered, was arrested, and is waiting somewhere for a trial. Venezuela, the country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, is now managed by a Washington-aligned government, its resources flowing into exactly the supply chain we described in Puzzle Piece 2. Iran capitulates and Iran becomes Venezuela, loses Hormuz as a weapon. It loses its leverage permanently. It becomes a permanently dependent state, with its resources flowing in directions decided by others. Option 2. Fight. Infrastructure gets destroyed, civilian casualties mount real pain, real cost. But if Iran holds long enough, it controls Hormuz. The entire Gulf depends on Tehran's goodwill. Regional reconstruction can be funded by that leverage, and Iran emerges from the rubble not as a defeated country, but as a civilization that proved, again, that it cannot be broken. With 3,000 years of history as their guide, Iran has made this calculation before, and they know where the empires that tried to break them are now. Capitulation is certain, permanent death for a nation. Fighting is a death that can be survived, if the math is right. 3 asymmetric weapons make Iran confident in that math. Weapon 1: cost attrition. America admitted it had enough ammunition for 4 days of high-intensity combat. Iran produces 500 drones per day, each costing a few $1,000s. America shoots them down with Patriot missiles and SM-6 interceptors, costing between $1 and $4 million each. Run the numbers. Iran launches 100 drones, cost to Iran roughly $200,000, cost to America at minimum $100 million. A cost exchange ratio of 1 to 500 entirely in Iran's favor. Iran can sustain that rate indefinitely. America cannot manufacture interceptors fast enough to keep pace. The stockpile that was already depleted after 2 years of supplying other conflicts will not survive a prolonged war of attrition. Weapon 2: the martyr calculus. When the bombs fell, the world watched to see what Khamenei would do. Some expected him to disappear into a hardened bunker. Some expected emergency calls to Moscow and Beijing, desperate requests for a ceasefire. Instead, the 86-year-old man appeared on national television, sitting calmly at his desk, no bunker, no relocation, and recited a single verse from the Quran about those who die for their faith. The message needed no translation. We are not surrendering. The American public cannot sustain casualties. 10 soldiers killed makes national headlines. 100 triggers a political crisis. 1,000 ends a war regardless of military results on the ground. Iran fought Iraq for 8 years. 8 years with hundreds of thousands of casualties. They do not measure conflicts in news cycles. They measure in generations. That is not a mindset any model at the Pentagon was built to process. Weapon 3: global economic pressure. Hormuz closing does not only hurt America, it hits Japan, South Korea, India, and China, none of whom wanted this war and none of whom wanted to drag on. The pressure from Tokyo, Seoul, and New Delhi on Washington grows every week the strait stays closed. Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, watching their own infrastructure take collateral damage in a war they did not choose, will quietly open back channels to Tehran. Buying peace at a price only they and Iran will ever know, bypassing Washington entirely. Iran does not need to defeat the US military in the field. Iran needs to hold long enough. Long enough for American allies to quietly step back. Long enough for American public opinion to turn. Long enough for oil-driven inflation to reach a point that no administration can survive politically. They do not need victory. They need America to leave. And here is the coldest conclusion in all 4 puzzle pieces. Iran is not fighting to win today. Iran is fighting to make America lose tomorrow. That is the difference between a 250-year-old empire sensing the weight of its own decline, and a 3,000-year-old civilization that watched Alexander arrive and depart, that saw Genghis Khan burn the libraries of Baghdad and then dissolve into history, that survived the Ottomans and the British and a coup engineered from Langley, Virginia. Every one of those forces came. Every one was stronger than Iran at the time. Every one is gone. Iran is still here. They know how to wait. They have done it more times than any superpower currently on the map. 4 puzzle pieces. 4 layers of the same story. The financial architecture behind the war. The timing that made this summer the point of no return. The convergence of interests that made the trigger pull almost inevitable. And the civilization on the other side that has a very different definition of what losing looks like. But anatomy is only half the story. Knowing how a machine was built does not tell you when it breaks, or what breaks with it. The question that matters most is still sitting there, unanswered. How does this end? Not the ending Washington is engineering. Not the ending Tehran is declaring. The ending that history, the most impartial judge that has ever existed, is writing one day at a time. And the answer depends on a force that neither side controls, that neither side can predict. And that has ended every empire that ever believed it was the exception. Time. Something neither side can control. We left it there. Now it is time to name it. But first, step all the way back, not one step, all the way. High enough to see the shape of the entire board at once. Because when you are standing in the trenches, all you see is smoke and chaos. Step far enough back, and you see something different. You see the shape of the war. And the shape of this war looks nothing like what the headlines have been drawing. Something neither side can control. We left it there. Now it is time to name it. But first, step all the way back. Not one step, all the way, high enough to see the shape of the entire board at once. Because when you are standing in the trenches, all you see is smoke and chaos. Step far enough back and you see something different. You see the shape of the war. And the shape of this war looks nothing like what the headlines have been drawing. Place all 4 puzzle pieces on the table. Piece 1. America did not strike Iran out of greed. America struck out of fear. Fear of the day the petrodollar dies. Fear of the morning when $34 trillion in national debt no longer has anyone left to quietly absorb it. This is a superpower cornered by its own system, making a desperate move before the walls close in completely. Piece 2. The timing was not an accident. This was a calculated financial operation disguised as a military one. Destroy Middle East oil supply, force the world back onto the dollar, restart the petrodollar loop before it collapses. The bombs are the instrument. The dollar is the objective. Piece 3. Trump signed the order because 4 separate pressure streams hit the same pressure point at the same moment. Israel needed to eliminate a regional rival before the window closed. The generals needed to justify their existence. The neocon cabinet had personal stakes in diplomacy failing. And Trump had his own political math to solve. None of them designed the board. All of them moved pieces on it. Piece 4. Iran did not collapse because Iran is playing a completely different game. The attrition game of a 3,000-year-old civilization that has outlasted every empire that ever tried to break it. They do not need to win today. They need America to lose tomorrow. Put all 4 pieces together and the real question becomes impossible to ignore. This is not a war about nuclear weapons, not about missiles, not about human rights or democracy or any of the clean, television-friendly language the spokespeople read into cameras. This is a war about who controls the global financial order for the next 30 years. The petrodollar system that Washington has run for 50 years, or the multi-currency world taking shape from Beijing to Moscow to Riyadh. A world where every barrel of oil must be paid for in dollars, or a world where yuan, rupees, dirhams, and gold can do the job just as well. Washington's order, or something that replaces it. That is the question this war is trying to answer with explosives, because every other method of answering it had already failed. Now picture the board differently. There is a room, multiple players, each moving pieces according to their own logic. America is pushing toward Hormuz, trying to lock down the oil faucet before it slips out of reach permanently. Every move is about buying time for a system that is running out of it. Israel is playing the night, jumping over every diplomatic and geographic barrier, creating situations that leave everyone else with only one move available, and that move is always escalation. Iran is pulling back one step at a time, but every step back costs the other side something. Time, treasure, body bags, and Iran has more patience than any of its opponents have electoral cycles. The American generals are optimizing for their own institutional survival, not for strategic coherence. Their pieces move in ways that protect budget lines and chain of command positions, not in ways that win wars. The neocon cabinet moves in straight lines, maximum force, no peripheral vision, running a doctrine that was written in 1996, tested in Iraq, and never once revised after the results came in. And Trump is holding the most powerful piece on the board. But he is surrounded by too many people whispering different moves, and he is listening to all of them at once. Now here is the player that changes everything. They are not in the room, they are standing outside the window, watching, patient. With something warm to drink and an expression that gives nothing away. You have probably already guessed who they are. They are the country that benefits from every week this war continues. The country whose currency gains credibility every time the dollar is used as a weapon. The country whose infrastructure contracts are waiting the moment the shooting stops and someone has to rebuild. They have not fired a single shot. They have no troops in the Gulf, no bases, no special envoys running between capitals. And yet every single day this war continues. Their position on the global board gets stronger. This is what neither side can control. This is the answer to the question we left open at the beginning. Not weapons, not oil, not ideology. The observers becoming the inheritors, while the two fighters are too busy destroying each other to look up. Now sit with one final paradox, the deepest one in this entire story. America launched this war to save the dollar, to force the world back into the petrodollar system, to prove that Washington is still the center of gravity of the global order. But every day the war runs, it is doing the opposite. Every image of a school in rubble, every tomahawk that hits a market instead of a missile site, every press conference where the stated reason for the war is different from the one 3 weeks ago. Each of these is eating away at the one thing the petrodollar cannot function without. Trust. Trust that America is the guarantor of global order, not the force dismantling it. Trust that the dollar is a safe harbor, not a weapon aimed at any country that steps out of line. Trust that allying with Washington brings stability, not a one-way ticket into someone else's war. Every day the fighting continues. More countries quietly accelerate their exit from dollar dependency. Not because they hate America, because they are watching this war and doing the same math. They do not want to be the next example. The weapon being used to defend the petrodollar is slowly killing the petrodollar. That is the full picture. A superpower fighting to protect its financial architecture with actions that are corroding the moral foundation that architecture rests on. A nation absorbing destruction, counting the days until American political tolerance runs out. And in the shadows at the edges of the board, other hands, patient and unhurried, picking up every piece that falls, placing each one exactly where they calculated it would land, long before the first bomb was dropped. But this is still not the end. Because in every game, no matter how carefully it was engineered, no matter how many variables were mapped before the first move, there are always plays nobody in the room saw coming. Plays that do not come from strategic models or war game simulations. They come from something that no algorithm captures. Ordinary people, on both sides, making choices in the dark that history will remember long after their names are gone. And one more thing. There is a third country watching this board. Not America, not Iran, not Israel. A country that has said very little publicly, moved very quietly, and positioned itself with the kind of precision that only comes from planning something long in advance. And if its next move lands the way it appears to be designed to land, it will not just change who wins this war. It will change what winning means. A third country, a move that, if it lands, changes the rules of the entire game. We stopped there. But before revealing that move, let us do something every serious strategist does after a major conflict starts. Sit down. Stop watching the explosions, and start counting the things that do not show up on television. Who is losing what? Who is gaining what? And who is sitting somewhere quiet, not mentioned in any headline, picking up everything the others are dropping. Because in every major war in history, the real winner is almost never the one who fired the first shot. Start with the losers. And the first loser, also the most surprising one, is not Iran. Picture Dubai in week 2 of the war. On the surface, the glass towers still catch the morning sun. The supercars still roll down Sheikh Zayed Road. But inside the high-end supermarkets along Dubai Mall, shelves are starting to empty in a way this city has not seen in its 50-year existence. Dubai imports 90% of its food, 90%. A city of 3.5 million people fed almost entirely by cargo ships arriving from around the world every single day, without interruption. When Hormuz closes, when maritime insurance costs explode, when international shipping companies refuse to enter an active war zone, those ships stop coming. 7 days, that is how long Dubai can feed itself before a food crisis begins. 14 days before its freshwater supply, dependent on desalination plants running on imported electricity, becomes a serious problem. The wealthiest people in Dubai did not wait for day 7. They had already moved their money. To Singapore, to London, to Swiss accounts, to real estate across Southeast Asia. Thousands of millionaires and billionaires pulled capital out of Gulf banking systems, not in panic, because they read the signals months earlier than everyone else. What Dubai spent 50 years building, the thing they sold to the entire world as a brand, not the towers or the man-made islands, but the idea of a safe haven in a chaotic region, that cannot be bought back. No per-campaign, no amount of oil money, erases the image of empty shelves and am lines in week 2 of a regional war. Saudi Aramco infrastructure, partially destroyed. We energy facilities, partially destroyed. The single income source that sustained these nations for decades, gone not for months but for years. And those years are precisely the years they need the money most. To rebuild, to stabilize, to answer the questions their own citizens are now asking out loud. The Gulf states walked into this war thinking they were spectators on the sidewalk. They came out looking like pedestrians hit by the car anyway. But the Gulf states at least have oil revenues waiting on the other side of reconstruction. Europe does not have that luxury. Look at the European energy map in 2026 and try not to feel vertigo. Nord Stream, the Russian gas pipeline that powered European industry for decades, was destroyed in 2022. Europe survived barely by buying liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the United States at prices many times higher, and by quietly cutting industrial output through the hardest winters since World War I. Now in 2026, Qatari Ling disappears along with Hormuz. The backup plan has no backup. Here is what that means in practical terms. German factory output slows, French heating bills double, Spanish trucking costs spike. And because Europe is the world's largest trading bloc, the slowdown ripples outward. American exporters lose buyers. American manufacturers see parts shortages. What happens in a German factory eventually shows up in a store in Io. This is not somebody else's problem. The German economic model, the engine of the entire European economy, was built on 3 pillars. Cheap Russian energy, efficient manufacturing, a massive export market in China. All 3 pillars have cracked one by one between 2022 and 2026. Not because Germany made obvious mistakes, but because they were positioned at the exact intersection where every geopolitical earthquake strikes. And on that cracking foundation, a new refugee wave is forming. Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians, Yemenis. Not because they want to leave home, because home is on fire. They will move toward Europe because there is nowhere else to go. And Europe, already struggling with internal crises it has not resolved, will face social pressures that no current government is equipped to manage. Europe is not a combatant in this war. Europe is the collateral damage, and nobody asked its opinion. Now the biggest loser of all, the one that did not have to end up here. America. Not because they will lose on the battlefield. They might not. Bombs will fall, Iranian infrastructure will be destroyed, and at some point the White House will hold a press conference and declare victory on live television. But winning a battle and winning a war are 2 completely different things. Americans learned that in Vietnam. They relearned it in Iraq. And the bill for forgetting the lesson is coming due again. Remember what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs admitted to Congress. 4 days of ammunition. And Iran produces 500 drones per day. This conflict, even in the most optimistic Pentagon scenario, will cost trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, and decades of regional commitment in a theater that American voters have not wanted to return to since 2003. There is a recent precedent worth examining. Operation Prosperity Guardian, the US-led campaign to protect commercial shipping from Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, ended in a quiet withdrawal that nobody officially called a withdrawal. America could not win. America could not afford to be seen losing, so they stopped, renamed the operation, and hoped the news cycle would move on. The Houthis are a non-state militia in one of the poorest countries on earth. Iran is at least 100 times more capable, in missiles, in drones, in organizational depth, in strategic patience. But the damage is not just money and blood. The damage is what comes after. American allies around the world, from South Korea to Japan to the smaller nations currently choosing sides in a reorganizing global order, are watching every move. They watched America enter a war with 5 official justifications that all contradicted each other. They watched 51 elementary school girls die from a misfired tomahawk, and they are asking a question too uncomfortable to say in public. If this is how Washington treats the rules it built, what does an alliance with Washington actually guarantee? Geopolitical credibility erodes fast and rebuilds slowly. America is spending it at a rate that has no historical precedent in the post-war era. Now cross to the other side of the board. The winners. Work from the bottom up, because the biggest winner is always the one fewest people are watching. Does Iran win or lose? The answer depends entirely on which timeline you measure. By today's measure, looking at the bombed cities, the destroyed power plants, the hospitals running out of medicine, the families searching through rubble, Iran is losing in the most direct and painful sense imaginable. But look at 5 years from now, 10 years. If Iran holds, if the government does not collapse, if the military does not fragment, if the will to resist is not broken, one thing does not change: Hormuz stays in Tehran's hands. Every Gulf nation producing 30% of global oil must negotiate with Iran to keep exporting. Iran does not own Gulf oil. Iran controls the only exit for Gulf oil. That leverage is stronger than ownership. And reconstruction money will come. It always does. Companies from across the world will arrive to rebuild what was destroyed. The financing comes from oil revenue flowing through Hormuz every day, every year for decades. Iran has been here before. They know what comes after the fire. There is one more thing no bomb can destroy. Every missile that hits Tehran, every school that collapses, every child killed, is doing something that no propaganda machine could accomplish in a generation. It is creating the next generation of Iranians with a shared memory that cannot be erased. And that memory does not point toward surrender. It points the other direction entirely. Now look east, much further east and south, to a region most Western analysts forget to include in the equation: Southeast Asia. Watch the capital flows first. Singapore is quietly absorbing a massive inflow of wealth from Gulf families who decided early they needed a second home for their assets. The velocity is accelerating with every week of fighting. Stable legal system, no direct involvement in the conflict, positioned at the center of a rising region. But the bigger story is structural, not financial. Global supply chains, already reorganizing after the pandemic, already accelerating after the US-China trade war, are now moving faster away from risk concentrations. When the Middle East is destabilized, when Europe is consumed by an energy crisis, when both Hormuz and Suez are disrupted, manufacturers and logistics companies need alternative hubs with 4 qualities: stability, port access, production capacity, workforce. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. These names are appearing more frequently in corporate strategic planning sessions than at any point in the past 2 decades. Not because of anything those countries did this week, because geography and timing are converging in a way that happens once in a generation. The question is not whether the opportunity is real. The question is whether there are leaders with enough vision to capture it before the window moves on. Now climb higher, to the tier of the genuinely large winners. China has not one soldier in the Middle East in this conflict. Not one warship in the Gulf. Not one public statement of support that could be cited as evidence of involvement. From the outside, China looks entirely neutral, calling for restraint in the diplomatic language they use in every international crisis, language designed to mean everything and commit to nothing. That is precisely what they want everyone to see. Here is the difference between chess and Go, and why it matters for understanding what China is doing. In chess, you win by attacking directly and capturing pieces. In Go, no pieces are ever captured. You win by surrounding your opponent, controlling space, cutting off options one by one until they have nowhere left to move. The best Go players never confront directly when they can avoid it. One day you look at the board and realize you have been encircled without knowing when it happened. While America is consuming itself in the Middle East, the pressure Washington applies on Taiwan and the South China Sea quietly decreases. American warships need to be somewhere else. American attention needs to be somewhere else. The window in the Western Pacific opens wider, more quietly, and with more strategic consequence than any formal agreement could create. The yuan, already replacing the dollar in bilateral trade arrangements, gains another argument. When America demonstrates it will bomb a country to protect its monetary system, nations sitting on the fence between the 2 global orders start asking whether the alternative currency might be safer. Not because they trust China, because they fear Washington. And when the smoke eventually clears and Iran needs to rebuild, who arrives first with contracts and capital? Look at the pattern: Iraq after the invasion, Libya after Gaddafi, Syria after the civil war. China fought in none of those places. But China won the reconstruction contracts in all of them. Buying assets at the lowest prices, building infrastructure when need was highest, creating dependencies when partners had no other options. Iran will not be the exception. Now the biggest winner of all, the one who has been present in this story from the beginning, always described as the architect of situations, never as the one who benefits most from them. Israel. Look at this directly, no hedging, no deflection. Israel entered this game with the clearest objective, the lowest direct cost, and the most detailed plan for the day after. In any strategic competition, that is the definition of the smartest player at the table. The strategic objective has been consistent for decades. Iran is the only remaining regional rival with the scale, the technology, and the proxy network to genuinely threaten Israeli strategic dominance in the Middle East. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the Shia militias in Iraq, all roads lead back to Tehran. Removing Iran from the regional equation for a generation is not a secret objective. Israeli security officials have stated in policy forums for years, in plain language. And now that objective is being executed, not by Israeli soldiers, by American ones. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are weakened. The nations that were potential regional competitors are consumed by economic and social crisis. When everyone else around you is bleeding, you do not need to be exceptionally strong, you only need to be the last one still standing. And right now, Israel is the only intact regional power in the Middle East. Now here is the part almost nobody discusses. For decades, Israeli engineers and investors have studied and promoted a project called the Ben Gurion Canal, an artificial waterway cutting through the Negev Desert, connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, designed to compete directly with Egypt's Suez Canal. Think about what that means right now. Hormuz disrupted, Suez threatened by regional chaos, global trade routes desperately seeking stability, and a proposed alternative, controlled by the one country in the entire Middle East that is intact, stable, and backed by the most powerful military alliance on Earth. Who collects the tolls on that canal? Who controls 20 to 30% of global trade flowing through it every year? Think about that number, and then think about who benefits from the current routes being unreliable. The financial story goes deeper still. The capital accumulated over 50 years of Gulf oil wealth, trillions of dollars now searching for a safe harbor because Dubai and Riyadh no longer feel permanent, is moving, some to Singapore, some to London, and a growing share is flowing into Israel, through financial relationships built quietly over decades, through investment funds and technology ventures, and real estate projects that attract no attention when every camera is pointed at the battlefield. Then there is technology. Israel has built one of the most consequential technology sectors on Earth, particularly in artificial intelligence and surveillance systems. In a world reorganizing around security anxieties, demand for those capabilities does not shrink, it compounds. Step back and look at the full board one last time. America is burning trillions of dollars trying to rescue a financial system rotting from the inside. Iran is absorbing destruction to prove it cannot be conquered. The Gulf states are discovering that 50 years of prosperity rested on foundations they never stress-tested. Europe is paying for the strategic autonomy it never chose to build. China is encircling quietly. Russia is watching silently and benefiting from every week of American distraction. Southeast Asia is standing in front of a generational opportunity that will reward those with vision and punish those who hesitate. And somewhere on this board, an architect is watching all the pieces move according to a design drawn long before the first explosion, and preparing the next move with the calm of someone who has already calculated several steps ahead. But this is still not the end. Because inside all of these cold, precise calculations sits one variable that none of the architects can model. One force that history has demonstrated, without a single exception across thousands of years, can overturn any board, break any plan, and generate outcomes that no algorithm and no strategist can anticipate. People. Not the leaders, not the generals, not the financial architects sitting in quiet rooms, ordinary people on both sides of every line, making small decisions every day, decisions that seem insignificant alone but accumulate into something unstoppable. In Tehran, a 22-year-old engineer who 3 years ago was posting about wanting to leave Iran, now cannot imagine leaving. In a town in Oyo, a mother whose son just shipped out is starting to ask questions she never asked before. In a village in southern Iraq, a family that lost their home is making a decision about which direction to walk. None of these people will appear in any newspaper. None of them are calculating petrodollar dynamics or Ben Gurion Canal transit fees. But the sum of their choices, multiplied by millions, is the wave that no one in that room saw coming. And it is building right now. That wave is building right now. We stop there. Now let us say the quiet part out loud, the part mainstream coverage dances around, the part Washington wants you to accept without examining, that this ends fast. A few weeks of strikes. Iran feels the pressure, a deal gets signed, and the world returns to something resembling normal. That is the story being sold. Here is why it will not hold. There is a quote that every military strategist should have on the wall above their desk. Mike Tyson said it, and it is more strategically accurate than most things written in foreign affairs. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Trump had a 4-day plan: lightning strikes, nuclear facilities destroyed, victory declared. A clean, cinematic ending with a clear arc. The kind of story that writes itself into history books. Iran punched back on day 1. And from that moment, everything began moving outside the boundaries of any plan drafted in a Washington conference room. Here is why quick was never possible. Not because Iran outguns America, but because Iran holds 3 cards that Venezuela never had. 3 cards that make every fast exit scenario structurally impossible. Card 1: the Hormuz lever. The moment Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, this stops being a bilateral conflict between Washington and Tehran. It becomes a global emergency. Japan gets 90% of its oil through that 21-mile choke point. So do South Korea, China, and India. All of them lost their supply in a single night. These countries do not hate Iran. They do not love America unconditionally. They have concrete economic interests that are being directly damaged. The pressure from Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing, and New Delhi does not arrive after months of diplomatic maneuvering. It arrives after days of empty fuel gauges and slowing factories. That is the kind of pressure no American ally can absorb indefinitely without losing their own government to the next election. Card 2: the cost exchange. Iran produces 500 drones per day. Each one costs a few $1,000s. America shoots them down with Patriot missiles and sends SEM-6 interceptors priced between $1 and $4 million each. The cost exchange ratio runs 1 to 500, entirely in Iran's favor. And the American stockpile, already depleted after 2 years of supplying multiple other conflicts, cannot survive a sustained war at that burn rate. America runs out of interceptors first. This is not a geopolitical prediction. It is basic arithmetic. Card 3: the card no equation can model. When the bomb started falling, an 86-year-old man did not run to a bunker. He sat at his desk, appeared on camera, and recited scripture, calm, unhurried, unafraid. That image needed no translation for 90 million Iranians watching. Americans have very low tolerance for casualties. 10 soldiers killed is a front-page headline. 100 is a political crisis. 1,000 ends a war regardless of what is happening on the ground. Iran fought Iraq for 8 full years, absorbing hundreds of thousands of casualties, and did not fracture. That is not propaganda. That is documented history from a conflict that ended less than 40 years ago. The cultural tradition of meaningful sacrifice over dignitiless surrender is not a rhetorical device. It is a force that no Pentagon simulation has ever successfully accounted for. Now look at the trap Iran has constructed, not with weapons, with logic, patient, deliberate, structural logic. America cannot end this quickly. That is the first fixed reality. From that reality, Washington follows the predictable path of modern attrition doctrine. When military targets run out, shift to civilian infrastructure, power grids, water treatment, hospitals, make daily life unbearable enough. The theory goes, and the population forces its government to the table. The effect runs in the opposite direction. Bombing civilians does not break will, it forges it. The German Blitz did not make London surrender. It unified the British in a way that years of peacetime politics never managed. American bombing campaigns in North Vietnam did not fragment the resistance. They hardened it into something that ultimately outlasted the most powerful military on earth. Iran is walking a road with very clear historical precedents. And none of those precedents end the way the bombers intended. Unable to break Iran from the air, Washington starts calculating what a ground campaign requires. Independent military analysts put the minimum at 500,000 troops, just to control border regions. Professor Jiang at Harvard, who has studied every major American military intervention since 1945, estimates 2 million troops for genuine regime change in a country with Iran's terrain, population of 90 million, and centuries of resistance culture embedded in its national identity. 2 million troops. The entire active-duty American military totals approximately 1.3 million, stretched across the entire planet. There is only one mechanism that closes that gap: the draft, mandatory conscription, something the United States has not used since Vietnam. The last time it was used, it helped end a presidency and split a generation down the middle. And here is where the trap closes completely. Independent polling from the opening days of this conflict consistently shows 70 to 80% of Americans opposed to it. Not a vocal fringe, not partisan opposition. An overwhelming majority of the American public watching a war they cannot explain to themselves, for reasons that keep changing, with no answer to the question a parent asks when their child's draft notice arrives. Why does my kid have to go? When those notices go out, the streets of America become the second front, not metaphorically, physically, with crowds and the forces deployed to manage them. The Pentagon has already drafted contingency plans for that scenario. That fact alone tells you everything you need to know about how the people running this war see it ending. Iran is not losing a war. Iran is executing a trap engineered not to destroy America on a battlefield, but to exhaust it from the inside politically, economically, socially, over time. Now watch the domino chain. Domino 1 falls in the Gulf within weeks. Iran's drones continue hitting Saudi Aramco refineries, Qatari export terminals. The Gulf governments face a choice with no correct answer. Keep paying Washington to fight a war dismantling their own infrastructure, or negotiate directly with Tehran, buying a private peace at a price only they and Iran will know. When water systems begin straining, when grocery shelves thin out, when citizens start demanding accountability, that choice answers itself. Domino 2 falls somewhere nobody in the White House Situation Room is prepared to discuss. Pakistan. Pakistan holds a mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. If the Saudi threat level crosses a certain threshold, Islamabad must evaluate its treaty obligations. This matters for one reason above all others. Pakistan is the only Muslim-majority nation on earth with nuclear weapons. If Pakistan enters this conflict in any operational capacity, it is the first time in human history that a nuclear-armed Islamic State has directly engaged in a Middle Eastern war. Stop and hold that sentence for a moment. Every calculation by Washington and Tel Aviv, every war game, every contingency plan has to be scrapped and rebuilt from the beginning. Every single one. The entire strategic architecture of this conflict changes shape overnight. Domino 3 falls in Northeast Asia. America draws down ammunition reserves prepositioned in South Korea to feed the Middle East theater. South Korea and Japan become thinner on immediate defense capacity. Kim Jong-un does not need to launch a single weapon. He raises the temperature just enough, some missile tests into the Pacific, some elevated rhetoric, then he sits down and waits. Washington will arrive at a negotiating table with concessions it would never have offered 6 months earlier. Geopolitical extortion at the national scale. It works precisely because America is too extended to respond from a position of strength. Domino 4 falls in Ukraine. The flow of artillery shells and air defense interceptors from Europe and South Korea to Kyiv slows. Europe is simultaneously losing Russian gas and Middle Eastern oil, absorbing a new refugee wave from the conflict zone, and running out of the domestic political consensus to sustain aid for a war thousands of miles away, when people at home cannot afford to heat their houses. Russia advances in Ukraine while the world's attention is pointed south. The war that was supposed to be finished years ago gets a second life at the worst possible moment. Domino 5 is the one no official will name, but everyone watching can see it forming. American streets. A government moving in direct opposition to 70 to 80% of its own population has one explanation. The system has drifted far enough from its citizens that it no longer requires their agreement. When draft notices arrive in mailboxes and young people face orders to fight in a war they cannot explain and did not choose, that gap between government and governed does not stay abstract, it becomes physical, visible, loud. The domestic United States becomes an internal conflict zone. This is not a foreign war anymore. This is a constitutional crisis activated by a conflict happening half a world away. History has a rule written in the collapse of every empire that ever existed. When an empire is forced to go to war simply to preserve its own economic system, the war is already lost. The question is only how long the losing takes. Rome did not fall in a day. It spent a century overextended, fighting wars with no clear definition of victory, running military budgets that its economy could no longer support, and staffing a bureaucracy so bloated it spent more energy maintaining itself than governing. Roman senators still gave speeches about eternal Roman strength in the decades when the legions were already stretched thin across 3 continents. Sound familiar? The empire does not announce its own decline. It simply keeps spending until the morning it cannot. America in 2026 is standing at a threshold that future historians may look back on and mark precisely, not as a single catastrophic collapse, but as the decision point after which the trajectory had only one direction available. Now look at what rises from the wreckage. The new order is forming on 3 pillars, and they are already visible to anyone paying attention. Pillar 1 is forming at the center of the conflict. Israel is the only regional power in the Middle East to emerge from this period intact, while every rival weakens simultaneously. The Ben Gurion Canal project, studied and promoted for decades, now has a geopolitical environment it was never able to count on before. Hormuz disrupted, Suez under threat. Global trade desperate for a stable alternative route, and one proposed solution, controlled by the one country in the region that is stable, intact, and backed by the world's most powerful military alliance. Gulf capital fleeing instability is looking for new homes. Israeli technology, particularly in AI and surveillance, is in higher demand in a world reorganizing around security anxiety. The country that appeared to light the match is engineering, what gets built after the fire. Pillar 2 is forming to the east, and it has been under construction for years. The UN fills space the petrodollar is vacating. BRICS, now representing 45% of the world's population, builds financial institutions designed to provide alternatives to the IMF and World Bank. Not in a year, not in 5, but in a direction that cannot be undone. Russia and China are not creating this shift. They are accelerating one that was already happening. Every nation that watches this war and recalculates whether the dollar is a safe harbor or a loaded weapon moves the same direction. Steadily, quietly. Pillar 3 is forming in a region this video has returned to several times, and not by accident. Southeast Asia is not watching this reorganization from a distance. It is positioned at the center of it. Capital fleeing the Gulf is moving east, and a meaningful portion is landing in Southeast Asia, drawn by production costs, skilled workforces, and geographic positioning that cannot be replicated elsewhere. Global supply chains rerouting away from Chinese concentration and Middle Eastern instability are finding new anchors in Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. The South China Sea, for years discussed primarily as a territorial dispute, is now the most commercially vital waterway on Earth when both Hormuz and Suez are simultaneously disrupted. In every major historical disruption, there are nations at the right intersection of geography and timing. That is not luck. That is the result of being positioned correctly when the map redraws itself. The question is not whether the opportunity is real. The question is whether the people running these countries can see it clearly enough to act on it before the window moves. This is where the game stands, as far as any honest analysis can see it today. But here is the thing about history. It never ends at a clean stopping point. Every ending is just a new beginning wearing different clothes. The Roman senators who watched the legions thin out did not know they were living in a transition. They thought they were living in a crisis that would pass. The British officials who watched Suez in 1956 did not know they were watching the final confirmation that their empire had already ended. They thought it was a setback. The people who will shape the next chapter are not the ones waiting for certainty before they move. They are the ones who read the map while it is still being redrawn. If this video helped you see the world at a depth that the daily news cycle cannot reach, share it with one person who needs to think more clearly about what is actually happening and why. Not to frighten them, to equip them. Subscribe if you want to keep going. Every video is a different map, a different set of questions we work through together. And remember the thing we started with, before the petrodollar, before Hormuz, before the 4 puzzle pieces. In every game this consequential, there are no spectators. There are only those who understand what is being played, and those who never realized a game was happening at all.